In this video we are going to study the English opening, which was called by Tartakower the strongest opening in the world. The English opening begins with the move c4. White's idea is to take control over the d5 square, to prevent black from playing d5. Next, white wants to advance with d4, which is the second fundamental strategic objective in the English opening. Now black can play e5, placing a pawn in the center and taking control of the d4 square. The idea of this move is to play like in the Sicilian defense but with colors reversed. Now, the most flexible move for white is knight c3, developing the queen's knight to its natural square and increasing the pressure against the d5 point. Black can play knight f6, developing the king's knight towards its natural square. Black plays like in the Sicilian defense but with the colors reversed. The idea of this move is to continue with d5 and begin actions in the center. g3. The Breman system. White wants to play in the style of the dragon variation with colors reversed. This move is very useful, since the king's bishop will be able to develop through the fianchetto, where it will be very well placed, since it will occupy the large diagonal of light squares and exert pressure on the center, increasing control over the important d5 square, and will also put pressure on the queen side. Now, black can play d5, occupying the center with his pawns. Black follows the typical game scheme of the Sicilian defense with the colors reversed. C takes d5. White eliminates the opponent's central pawn and exchanges it for his lateral pawn. In this way, white is left with a central majority of pawns. After knight takes d5, white can play bishop g2, developing his king's bishop and threatening to capture the opponent's knight. White's idea is to increase the pressure against the d5 square. The bishop is very well placed on the g2 square, as it puts pressure on the center and also points towards the queen side. Now it is not good to capture white's knight, since after knight takes c3, white recaptures with b takes c3 and reinforces his control of the center. Once white castles, he will be ready to advance in the center with d4 and assert his central pawn majority. Black can play bishop e6, to defend his knight. The drawback of this move is that black's knight blocks the action to his own queen and black has no control over the d4 square. White can continue with knight f3, developing the king's knight, attacking the e5 pawn and preparing to castle. After knight c6, developing the queen's knight and defending the e5 pawn. White's castle. Black can continue with bishop e7, completing the development of his minor pieces and preparing to castle. But now white can play d4. White realizes his main strategic objective in the English opening and wants to open the center, to assert his development advantage. White is ahead in 2 tempi compared to the dragon variation. 1 tempo because the colors are reversed and another tempo because white has taken his pawn to d4 in a single move. After the move bishop g2, black's best option is knight to b6, retreating the knight to a safe square and releasing the action to the queen along the d-file. So, black controls the d4 square and prevents white from occupying the center with his pawns. White can play knight f3, developing the king's knight on its natural square, attacking the e5 pawn and preparing to castle. Black can respond with knight c6, developing the queen's knight and defending the e5 pawn. White's castle. Now the move g6 would be a mistake, with the idea of developing the king's bishop through the fianchetto, since white responds with b3 and will be able to take his queen's bishop towards the a3 square, to prevent the opponent's king from castling. After, for example, bishop e6. White can play d3, reinforcing control over the e4 square. After bishop g7, completing the development of his minor pieces and preparing to castle. White plays bishop a3, completing the development of his minor pieces and at the same time preventing the black king from castling. White can continue with moves like rook c1, to occupy the c-file, which is a semi-open file. They will be able to take the knight to e4 from where it can jump to c5, to occupy a strong position in the enemy camp with the knight, and white exerts a lot of pressure and has an advantage. After white's castling, black's best option is bishop e7, developing the king's bishop and preparing to castle. White plays d3, reinforcing control over the e4 square and allowing the development of the queen's bishop. Black castles. From here, white follows the typical plans of the Sicilian defense. His idea is to advance with his pawns on the queenside and take advantage of the c-file to attack on the queenside. After advancing with a3 and b4, white will be able to develop his queen's bishop on the b2 square, where it will be very placed, as it will press against the e5 pawn. Or they can also develop it on the e3 square, from where it will point towards the c5 square, which is a good post in the enemy camp. They will be able to activate their queen-rook with rc1, to occupy the c-file. And they will be able to take a knight to the c5 square, where it will be very well placed, as it will press against the b7 pawn and work in perfect coordination with the g2 bishop, and together they will create many problems for black. For their part, unlike the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, black should not attack at all costs on the king side, as it could be very risky, because when playing with colors reversed they have less time. So they will not be able to attack with sufficient guarantees of success. However, a good plan for black is to use the ideas of the Karpov variation of the Sicilian defense. That is, they will be able to regroup their pieces with the moves rook to e8, bishop to f8, bishop to g4 and knight to d4, and will exert a lot of pressure against the center. If black succeeds in carrying out this plan, white could fall into a completely passive position. Another very good plan for black, if white has already advanced on the queenside with a3 and b4, is to play for the weak squares on the queenside. They can make moves like bishop e6, f6, a5, a4 and knight d4, with the idea of invading the weak squares on white's queenside with their pieces. In this type of structure both sides have two pawn islands, but white's queenside pawns could be vulnerable to attack with a5. As compensation, white controls the c5 square and has good play through the c-file. In addition, they have a central majority of pawns, which they can use to control the center. In the following videos we will study very illustrative games in which we will be able to see how all these plans can be put into practice.